Some claim that the ocean conceals secrets, while others assert that the ships themselves retain a record of every cry and every dread. We're bringing you 5 authentic, horrifying, and entirely true cruise ship horror stories tonight on Midnight Outcry. Every tale will make you wonder what's truly hiding beneath the waters, from shadows that follow to cabins that shouldn't be there. Hit subscribe and click the bell icon if you're brave enough to witness these personally. Tell us which story scares you the most in the comments section below. If you're brave enough, let's dive right in. Story 1. The water wasn't the first sound. It was neither the sound of the engines running or the conversation of people drinking cocktails on deck. I woke up to the sound of singing on the first night of my cruise. Not singing with delight, not a drunken gang coming back from the pub or karaoke. It was a low, melancholy sound that echoed through the air like a hymn inside a partially fallen church. I go by Rachel Cole. The Pacific Star trip is something I've been saving for more than a year as a high school music teacher from Virginia. After a difficult semester, I had promised myself that the sun and sea air would help me get over my ongoing migraines. However, I was surprised by the voices. They floated through my cabin's paper-thin Deck 7 walls. Initially, I assumed it was simply the sound of the engines tricking my exhausted mind, or perhaps a late-night practice for a performance in one of the ship's lounges. However, the melody was too peculiar, with notes that fell off key in ways that no experienced musician would permit, rising and falling like waves themselves. I put my ear on the wall. It wasn't another cabin that was singing. I hardly slept that night because it was coming from behind the walls themselves. When I eventually fell asleep, my dreams had white faces pressed against glass, mouths still singing, and water flowing into small hallways. It was a lovely morning. Too pretty, almost too typical to be hostile. Passengers were seated on deck chairs. The sun was shining, and waiters were slicing through the mob with trays of vibrant beverages. I made an effort to get rid of the discomfort. I even made fun of myself, putting it down to jet lag. However, I heard something during breakfast that made me sick. 2 older women at the table next to me stirred their coffee and whispered, with her speech barely audible over the clatter of plates. One leaned in close. Was it heard yesterday night? Once more the voices. Her pal tensed up and gave a ferocious headshake. Don't. Just don't. They both fell silent, their gazes focused on their food. As she saw me observing, I was curious, but I felt like I was the ghost when I asked around. I was dismissed by the passenger. Before shifting the topic to the weather, the pool, or the buffet, crew members grinned too broadly and courteously. Still, the tune is the same every night. Soft, far away, but now closer. It sounded like the person singing it was making their way, step by step, toward my cabin. I recorded it on the 3rd night. Additionally, there were words when I played it in the morning. Join us beneath the waves. The voice was in my ear as though I had been sleeping with someone standing next to me. I was in a serious situation by the 4th night, lacking sleep. The song would rise like the tide each time I closed my eyes. Sopranos, tenors, and other high-pitched voices layered in after the low ones, until the song seemed to be burrowing beneath my skin. That morning, I went up to the purser. I informed him that there was a problem with my cabin. I was so tired that my voice trembled. Not because I was nervous. Voices can be heard in the walls, singing. His eyes flickered, but his practiced smile remained constant. He was exposed by that tiny moment of indecision. We don't have any entertainment planned for that time, ma'am, he remarked with ease. Maybe the engines are vibrating. Before I could stop myself, the words were out. Engines don't sing in Latin. Some passengers hear things. He clenched his jaw. Everywhere I went for the remainder of that day, crew members appeared to be watching me. A server lingered at my table for too long and replenished my coffee 3 times without my request. I tried earplugs that night when a steward walked by me in the corridor while muttering something suspiciously similar to "Don't go below." Didn't function. My phone is making white noise. Didn't function. Clearer than ever. The chorus always made an impression. So I caved. I did what I was told. I slipped into the deserted hallway at 2:14 a.m., barefoot and with my heart pounding, like bones cracking in the dark. The ship squeaked about me, rolling waves and shifting metal. The music was gushing from behind a rusted maintenance door that read "Authorized personnel only." I followed the sounds as they led me down stairwells, through dimly lighted hallways that had a little mildew odor, and ultimately neared the entrance. I just paused once. I pushed it open after that. It was all black inside. The beam of my phone's flashlight cut through a far broader area than I had anticipated as I struggled for it. It was some sort of abandoned storage space, rather than a maintenance closet. Broken crates covered the floor, rusty pipes leaked seawater, and the walls were scarred with rust. However, it wasn't the room that made me freeze. The portraits were the cause. Curling with age, dozens of faded photos were fastened to the far wall. Passengers in vintage cruise ship clothes. Men, women, and kids. They were all singing with their mouths open. The words, "The drowned do not rest," were inscribed beneath the pictures in a black, sticky substance. They sing. The choir started to grow. My phone fell out of my grasp. Something pale caught the beam of the flashlight as it rolled across the floor. A hand, bloated, waterlogged, rigor mortis, stiffened fingers, protruding from under one of the containers. The singing stopped before I could yell. Complete quiet. Then there were footsteps, deliberate, heavy, following me down the hallway. I snatched up my phone, turned out the light, and leaned against the wall. It was too loud in my lungs. The door opened with a squeak. A man entered. Not a traveler. A crewman with a clean uniform and a blank countenance. He calmly scanned the room while standing among the crates, as though he belonged there. I briefly believed he hadn't noticed me. Then he started talking. Gently. The crewman's remarks reverberated around the empty bay. "You shouldn't have heard them." My throat tightened as I said, "You shouldn't have heard them." The calmness in his voice was worse than a shout, even though he hadn't increased it. As if I'd already gone too far and couldn't go back. I pressed farther into the shadow, trying to take a step back. My exposed heel fell into a pool of salt water. It was a deafening splash. He jerked his head in my direction. His flashlight beam immediately located me, as though he had known my location all along. Like a trapped animal, my heart pounded in my chest as I froze, blinded. He refrained from lunging. Didn't shout. His steady feet on the metal floor only brought him closer. Again, he added, "You've heard the choir. That means they'll want you now." I made myself say something, but my voice sounded rough and broken. "They'll want me, what do you mean?" With his flashlight quivering just a little in his hand, he examined me. It's hesitation, not terror. At last, he squatted down and moved the light over the hand I had observed. But it wasn't there now. All that was visible beneath the crates was a large, wet stain. "They take shape sometimes," he remarked. "They made them visible to us. But it never lasts." I felt sick to my stomach. Them. Who drowned? He made a strong line with his lips. He gave no straight response. Rather, he got up and gestured me to the door. "You must leave this place. You will follow the whispers if you stay, and you won't return." My entire body cried out for me to flee, but his tone dissuaded me. It was more than a warning. It was sympathy. I followed him nonetheless. We were silently engulfed by the maintenance corridor. All that was left was the ship's constant, quiet hum, like a giant's heartbeat while it slept. At last, I inquired, "Why me? There are other people traveling with me. How come I would hear them?" He didn't turn around. "Not everybody is able to." The words made my spine tingle. "Some ears are tuned. I'm tuned. Similar to a tool. What happens to those who do hear then?" He did look at me this time, his eyes dark and tormented. "Count the photos." I shut the door to my cabin and pushed a chair beneath the doorknob as if that would somehow keep me safe. There was no sleep. The walls were too lively. I could sense the voices even when they weren't singing. A vibration beneath my skin, a thrumming in the metal, as if the ship itself bore their pulse. The dreams began when I eventually fell into a choppy, shallow slumber. Narrow corridors are swallowed by dark water. Black brine, not singing, spilled from wide-open mouths, eyes bulging, faces pressed against glass portholes, lips moving to songs I didn't comprehend. My sheets were wet with perspiration when I woke up. A scream stuck in my mouth. Then I heard it once more. It's not the choir. A worse thing. Just one voice. A female's directly outside the door of my cabin, singing my name. The voice at my door sounded gentle, almost like a child's lullaby. However, it was my name. I remained motionless on the bed's edge. My entire body tensed and I gazed at the door handle. A tiny vibration came from the chair trapped beneath it, as though something was rubbing against the opposite side. I bit down on my fist to keep myself from responding. Rachel, the want to react, was so strong that it felt like the tune itself was pulling at unseen cords that ran through my chest. I assumed everything was ended when the voice died away, right up till the handle moved. Once, twice, slow, intentional. And then there was a knock. 3 wet, hollow raps, like knuckles on damp wood. Desperate for distance and oxygen, I retreated toward the porthole. Outside, a thin moonlight glinted on restless waves as the ocean stretched black and unending. I briefly believed I saw something just beneath the surface. It was a ripple that was too exact and human-shaped. I was unable to remain in the cabin. I grabbed my jacket, pushed the chair out of the way, threw open the door, and the hallway was deserted. There is nobody there. Only the faint buzz of the motors could be heard. I could still smell it though. Seawater, sharp and powerful, as though someone had just walked by, dripping wet. The ship seemed different now, and I almost ran for the elevators. Colder. As I moved, the lights above flickered, creating swift, strobing shadows that extended and bent along the corridor. I nearly ran into the same crewman from the cargo hold at the next turn. When he saw me, his expression tensed. "You opened it," he said bluntly. I took hold of his arm. There was a woman outside my room. He shook me off, his jaw clenched. "She shoo my name." "No one." The words struck more forcefully than they ought to have. "Something. And now it knows you opened the door. What should I do?" My voice broke. "How can I put an end to it?" He leaned forward, his voice urgent and piercing. "You don't. Whom do the drowning victims sing to? And after they've made up their minds, the only way out is..." He paused, looking around as if it were dangerous. "Is even say the answer. Following them down is the only way out." The deck trembled under us. Metal moaned long and sorrowfully somewhere deep within the hull, as if the ship itself were grieving. For 3 complete seconds the overhead lights went out. I heard them again in the darkness. Not weak, not far away. There in the hallway with us, words bending into tones that sank beneath my skin. A chorus that was moist and thick, singing and whispering simultaneously. Water was leaking from the floor's seams and moving toward our shoes as the lights came back on. The crewman's expression went white. "Run," he yelled, grabbing my wrist, and we did. We ran through the ship, down stairwells, through lounges that were empty, through corridors that smelled of mildew and brine. The water followed us everywhere. Inside the ship, a thin layer that was ankle-deep at first lapped at our heels as if the ocean itself were pursuing us. I was panting and sweating by the time we exploded onto an outside terrace. The night air struck me sharply and coldly. With a heaving chest, the crewman shut the door behind us. He remarked, "They're getting stronger." The sea spread endlessly around us as the wind roared across the ship. I've never seen them push this far above deck. Too many faces, with their mouths open in wordless song, appeared to me in the waves. Then a shape started to rise far out on the sea. Tall, shaped like a human, but incredibly large. It was made of foam and liquid shadow. Voices weren't the only thing lost. They were human, and it was on its way to us. It wasn't a solid figure, not in the sense that a body should be. Rising from the ocean, like water, it shifted, dissolved, then reassembled in an attempt to recall its former state. I could see its gaping maw, its hollow sockets, and the glimmer of hundreds of faces, swirling just beneath its skin. Though, even from a distance, the voices are louder out here, in the quiet. Now there was a surge of music that shook the railing beneath my hands, not just murmurs. Even though I couldn't understand the words, I understood them, and the crewman pushed me back, saying, "Join us. Come home. The water remembers. Don't pay attention." But he was trembling. "Don't you dare listen." He had tears in his eyes. Unconsciously, he shaped the song with his lips. A collision shook the deck, and I understood that he had been fighting them for a lot longer than I had. As I swung around, I noticed water leaking from the door's seams where we had just entered. After buckling and rattling, it burst forth, causing a flood to rip across the deck, sweeping tables, chairs, and lifebuoys in its wake. I almost fell over the railing as I stumbled. The song filled every part of me as it grew louder and deeper. It made my bones tremble. The crewman took hold of my arm with one hand and the railing with the other. Over the roar, he said, "They don't just want you to drown. It's terrible that they want you to belong." His hand shook. He glanced down at the ocean. I realized then that he wasn't saving me by holding me. The reason he was holding me was to draw me in. "Let go." I yanked my arm and yelled. His fingernails grew longer. "You're not getting it. We can't make it through this alone." The ocean figure swelled higher behind him, its watery arms extending over the horizon. "We either go down together, or we join them together." We were suddenly in the middle of a storm that should have been miles away, with waves as high as the lifeboats and rain whipping sideways. I let out a shout as I yanked my arm free. The ship swayed dramatically as the crewman lunged again. He fell on the slippery railing due to the tilt. Before being completely engulfed by the sea, his hand clutched at nothing, at the air. The voices rose victorious. The flood surged to my knees, then my waist, yet they weren't done with me. I was pulled down, inch by inch, by a burning cold. The choir had stopped sounding irate. They sounded understanding. Sure. A lighting on the mast pierced the rain as I stumbled toward the far end of the deck. I reasoned that perhaps if I remained in the light, perhaps if I stayed out of the shadows, they couldn't drown me. However, the light wavered. Then it went out for a breathless moment. The music ceased, waiting, not gone. And something worse than the shouts might be heard in the ensuing silence. The silence was worse than the song, and I could hear the ocean breathing. It felt like the entire sea was holding its breath as it slammed on my skull. I shivered and gasped as I held on to the railing, waiting for the sound to return. Not mine then screams. Not the crewmen's. Screams rose up from the passenger decks from below. They had also heard it. I staggered over to the edge and looked down. In their nightgowns, people flooded onto the lower deck, their terrified faces directed upward. They weren't yelling at the lightning or the waves. They were yelling at the object that emerged from the ocean. The size of the figure had increased. It was more than just a contorted silhouette, with its arms spread wide and a mosaic of faces thrusting outward. Men, women, and children, all still singing but without making a sound. It loomed over the ship like a cathedral of water. The spotlight then sputtered back to life as if on cue. The tune came back. However, it was no longer a whisper. The shouts shook the deck below me and engulfed the storm in a loud chorus. My brain screamed in agony. My knees gave way, and I came to a terrible realization. The figure was no longer the source of it. It came from the passengers. Their mouths opened one by one, while some wept in bewilderment and others yelled in fear. The music quickly crept into their throats as soon as the light struck them. After that, they stopped yelling. They were singing. The choir that had drowned had I staggered back, clutching my ears, but the boom was inside of me, not just in the air, as if my veins were throbbing with the ocean itself. My mouth twitched. I parted my lips. No, I tasted blood as I bit down hard. My body twitched as if it were no longer mine. With my heart pounding, I backed toward the mast and said, "Join us. The water remembers." I would be theirs if I gave in now, even for a moment. I suddenly recalled the flare gun. I fumbled with the emergency box that was fastened to the railing. The commotion had already broken the glass. 2 shells and the flare gun were inside, half submerged. As I loaded it, my fingers shook and the voices inside of me grew louder by the moment. Once more the spotlight wavered. Leaning closer, the figure now stood squarely above me, until I saw the singer from the opening night who had gone AWOL. Its face, if it could be called that, pushed forward, water expanding, distorting. Her face fell back into the chorus as her mouth widened and widened. I let go. The flare burned crimson across the black sky as it ripped through the storm. The melody stumbled for a heartbeat. The faces trembled. The passengers below dropped to their knees, clutching their ears, and I wondered whether I had broken it. Perhaps the solution was light. However, the flare extinguished. The song came back stronger than ever. The surge of water, the ship swayed. We were sinking, and I could feel it in my bones. This time, the choir didn't want to make a sacrifice. If the only way to avoid singing was to remain silent, then quiet would be mine. I placed the second shell into the flare pistol and raised it to my temple because they wanted everyone. However, as soon as I pressed the trigger, the voices stopped. They did not fade, not muffled, simply gone. There was silence on the deck. The storm had passed. The sea is tranquil, trembling. I lowered the rifle. Below, the people stood motionless, their heads cocked as though they were listening. Then slowly, as if waking from a dream, they started to move once again, puzzled and dazed. What about the figure? Disappeared. All passengers return to your cabins immediately. This incident is being handled. The captain's voice roared over the intercom, his words clear yet shaking, overlooking the lake. I gazed. The sea seemed flat, motionless, and naive. However, I was aware that it was not over, because I could still hear it if I closed my eyes even for a moment. Waiting, gentle and patient. The choir that drowned wasn't done yet. Story 2. I promise you, that first night at supper, I had a man seated across from me. He lifted his glass to salute our journey, introduced himself, and inquired about my origins. The following morning, however, I asked the waiter about him, and the response almost broke my heart. My name is Alex Monroe, and there was nobody seated there, sir. After a difficult divorce, I scheduled this cruise as a last-minute vacation. I'm 39 years old and work in real estate in Portland, Oregon. There was nothing otherworldly that I was searching for. All I wanted was sun, delicious cuisine, and perhaps a little diversion. You do realize that cruises are supposed to be safe, regulated, planned, and floating resorts. That's what I told myself when I got on the Aurora Maris. The ship was huge, with glass elevators, soaring decks, pools, and car-sized chandeliers. There was a subtle scent of salt water and fresh carpet in my cabin. Lounging by the pool, drinking too sweet to taste the wine, and enjoying an unending buffet with shrimp dishes that never ran out. The first day went by without incident. The majority of the other passengers were pensioners, families, and couples. I didn't feel welcome, but I did feel out of place. Things didn't change until dinner time. In the main dining hall, they seated me at a table that could accommodate 4 people, but only 1 seat was occupied. Despite the informal atmosphere, a man in his mid-40s wore a fine suit and was tanned. He grinned as though we had previously met. "You mean Alex?" He uttered those words. I went cold. "Indeed. How'd you?" He touched his glass's edge. "They informed me. The employees." Even though it was a simple explanation, his smile lasted a little too long. "They're very accommodating here." I didn't get his last name when he introduced himself as Martin. We made jokes about the overly dramatic string quartet playing in the corner and discussed the ship and the food. I could smell his pricey, woodsy fragrance. He was not a delusion. He was genuine. Of the second course, however, he leaned closer and said in a whisper, "You should be careful where you walk at night," which made me feel colder than the air conditioner ever could. Some corridors don't terminate where they should. I chuckled uneasily, thinking it was a joke, but his eyes remained fixed. Then he lifted his mug. I clinked mine to his, saying, "To safe travels." It was a metallic, piercing sound. I asked the server at breakfast the following morning if Martin would be returning. He scowled courteously. My stomach dropped when I said, "I'm sorry, sir, but you dined alone last night." I demanded, gave a thorough description of Martin. The odd warning, the cologne, the suit. However, the waiter simply nodded as if he were making fun of an inebriated customer. I was aware of what I had seen, though. I believed I did, however. The corridor felt longer than I recalled when I returned to my cabin that evening. The walls narrowed significantly, and the carpets continued until I came to a portion that wasn't shown on any of the map. There was only a blank corridor with flickering lights, no signage, no cabin numbers. Martin was standing at the far end of it. He made no gesture. He was not smiling. He simply cocked his head, perhaps anticipating my decision. He vanished as soon as I blinked. I realized this sounds crazy. I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't noticed the lights buzzing out one by one, and felt the chilly air flowing down that hallway. However, his statement from supper stuck with me. Some hallways don't end where they should. I also thought I heard footfall following me as I turned back toward my actual cabin, and they were exactly in time with mine. Until I shut the door and pushed the lock across. I couldn't quit thinking about him the following day. I reasoned that it must have been an error. Maybe a fellow traveler with a similar name. Or perhaps the waiter simply failed to observe him depart. But the details matched too precisely each time I mentally reenacted that exchange. The way he warned me about the halls, his voice, and his cologne. I had worked myself up to the point where I asked the front desk by noon. As the receptionist tapped at her keyboard, I leaned on the marble counter and whispered, "Pardon me, could you see if Martin, a passenger, is on board?" Her courteous grin wavered just a bit. "Martin. Last name, I'm not sure. English accent, dark suit, mid-40s. Last night he joined me for dinner." Her fingers froze on the keyboard. She shook her head after that. "I apologize, sir. We don't have anyone registered on this sailing with that name or description." I nearly burst out laughing, a mix of frustration and incredulity. "That isn't possible." She lowered her voice. "He sat across from me for 2 hours. Maybe you ought to get some rest. For some passengers, the first few days can be confusing." It felt more like a dismissal than a concern, as if she had said that line previously. I tried the buffet that night instead of the formal dining room. It was nearly normal enough: bright lights, conversation, children slapping pizza onto plates to soothe me. I took a plate of pasta and took a seat by the window by myself. Then I caught a glimpse of him through the glass's reflection. Martin, not occupying a table, not carrying a plate, just standing in the reflection, right behind me. Yet there was nobody there when I turned around. My fork fell to the ground with a clang. I got a weird glance from a couple close. I apologized in a whisper and didn't touch my dinner. I had a dream about him that night. Or perhaps I was not dreaming. The sound of a slow, deliberate knock on my cabin door roused me up. There are 3 knocks. Then there was quiet. Staring at the dim light beneath the door, I froze in bed. No footsteps, not a voice, only the ship's soft hum. "Don't open it," I said to myself. But a minute later, my cabin's phone rang. I almost fell out of bed when I leaped so hard. As I responded, my hand trembled, not moving. Then a voice, "Be calm." Known. The line died. Some hallways don't end where they should. The dial tone buzzed in my ear as I sat there with my heart racing, and I saw something that chilled me to the bone when I put the phone back in its cradle. The inside of the cabin glass was covered in moisture. The impression was that someone had been standing there, breathing against the window. I cornered a crew member in the corridor the next morning. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, and wore the white steward's outfit. "Hey," I said, perhaps a bit too forcefully. "Are you aware of Martin, a passenger?" His face immediately lost its color. I felt sick to my stomach as he looked around before whispering, "Don't talk about him here. So you do know him." He gave a swift shake of his head. "No one is meant to. Forget it, please." I was left staring after him as he quickly turned on his heel and walked away, saying, "For your own sake, ignore it." How was I able to? I stayed in the lounge till late that evening, avoiding the hallways as much as possible and staying in the busier area. However, the identical hallway was in front of me when I eventually started to return. Walls that are blank, lights that flicker, and once more, Martin at the far end. He grinned this time, a slow smile of knowledge. I made myself blink, to show he would disappear once more. However, he didn't. He moved forward a step, then another. As he got closer, the lights in the corridor flickered off one by one. I wanted to run, but instead I found myself motionless. My feet stuck to the carpet. One by one, the corridor lights behind Martin went off as he drew nearer, leaving only a few bulbs glowing dimly between us. I wanted to yell, to use a human voice to break the hush, but my throat was not cooperating. He halted when he was no more than 20 feet away. His face was as sharp and pallid as it had been at dinner that first night. Too much of the same. His countenance remained the same, with not a single wrinkle out of place, similar to a lifelike wax figurine. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered. The words came to me as though he were speaking right next to me. They weren't muffled by distance. I spun around and ran. I sped across the corridor, taking odd turns, until I collided with a group of laughing passengers close to the elevators, because my feet recalled how to move before my head did. Looking back, the hallway I had just left was completely typical. Bright, busy, and devoid of Mark. However, I could still smell his fragrance. I made another attempt to gather answers the following morning. This time it came from an older crew member who appeared to have worked on the ship for many years. He was polishing the brass railings by the observation deck when I caught him. He didn't even look up from his cloth when I said, "Sir," lowering my voice, "I need to ask you about a man named Martin. Did you see him?" My heart thumped. The man exhaled. "So he is real." "Very true." Then, almost in a whisper, "Not a traveler. Not anymore." He leaned forward after taking a tense look around. "There are some folks who never go. Yes, their bodies leave, but something remains. They are remembered by the ship. He's one of those." I started to say something more, but he abruptly became rigid and businesslike. Before I could add another word, he exclaimed loudly, "Enjoy your voyage, sir," and turned to go. I didn't even try to sleep that night. Around 3 in the morning, however, fatigue betrayed me. I sat up straight in bed, left the TV on, and told myself, if I don't close my eyes, he can't get in. The cabin lights were off when I woke up, even though I hadn't turned them off, so I guess I must have fallen asleep. And there he was, Mark, with his hands folded in his lap and his legs crossed neatly on the chair across from my bed. He was not blurred by the darkness. It sharpened him, if anything, as if the shadows were his own. "Why me?" In the quiet, my voice broke. He cocked his head. "Since you can see me, most people don't." I held onto the sheets. "What are you looking for?" "To go," he said plainly. "However, I am unable to. Not without assistance." A terrible idea intruded. Was he asking me to take his place? He asked, leaning forward. Before I could answer, the weight of his voice, like an anchor plunged into the sea, made it sharper. "Avoid the bottom decks at all costs. Whatever you hear." Then he vanished, dispersing like mist. There was no one in the chair. It was chilly outside, and the smallest sound, like faraway footfall resonating from somewhere deep inside the ship, floated through the cabin vents. I tried to get rid of it the following day. Kids splashed in the pool, bartenders giggled while mixing cocktails, and the terrace was bathed in sunlight. But while I continued to stumble my lines and everyone else read from a script, I had the impression that I was moving through a dream. Even so, Martin's advice to stay out of the lower decks kept coming to mind, which naturally meant I had to go there. I sneaked out of my berth at midnight, when most of the ship was asleep. As I walked to the service elevator, my footsteps were muted by my footwear. despite a sign that read "crew only." I pressed the button, as though they were waiting for me. The doors shook open. The descent seemed to go on forever, like a countdown. Each deck number flashed by: 6, 5, 4, 3. Eventually, the light above the door flickered out. Not a number. Nothing but quiet. The elevator shook and moaned as it came to a stop. I was greeted by a wall of chilly, musty air. As the doors groaned open, no passenger was supposed to see the tiny passage beyond, which had pipes running along the ceiling. I went outside. The ship felt less alive the farther I went. No voices, no sway of water, no buzz of engines, just echoes of nothingness. Then drip. Somewhere ahead there's a continuous dripping sound. My phone's light hardly made a path through the darkness as I followed it. I went by metal doors without handles, closed storage rooms, and odd stains on the floor that I couldn't place. I heard it at that point. Steps. Different. Heavy. Methodical. Following me. Not mirroring mine. I turned around. Nothing. However, a shadow darted across the far end of the hall as I turned around. Too tall. Too angular. Additionally, I didn't observe any crew members moving. I ought to have gone. My entire body cried out to flee. However, I continued to walk. At last, the hallway led to a spacious room. The ceiling was dripping with humidity, giving the impression of a forgotten storage area. Dozens of old life jackets hung like withered skins against the far wall, while rusty lifeboat parts were piled in piles. Then I saw something else. Partially scraped away but still visible, carved into the metal floor. Figures. Dates. Names. I squatted down to use my finger to trace them. These were not notes for maintenance. A record that they were tallies. An inventory of missing persons. Then I heard it once more. The voice. "What brought you here?" Martin. However, he wasn't the person waiting for me in the shadows as I turned around. His face was twisted, pallid and very thin over the bones due to something wearing it. The air tightened around my throat like a fist as it took a single stride forward. The same remarks as before. "You shouldn't be here." They no longer sounded like a warning though. They had a sentence-like sound. The figure moved forward. No sound should have gone that far, but every step seemed to reverberate through the deserted room. My heart pounded so loudly that I was positive I could hear it above the ship's hum. I staggered back, bumping into a pile of corroded lifeboat components. The flashlight on my phone flickered and eventually died. Darkness. I started to go when I heard a whisper, closer than it should have been. "You can't leave." That's when I realized the walls were alive. The shadows crawling across them were incorrect, but not moving exactly. They wrapped around one another in curiously human-like shapes as they twisted, reached out and clasped like hands. Those figures had been absent. The smell of rot and iron filled the air. My gut churned. Then I noticed it. A metal door that was slightly open, with light leaking from the crack. The light wasn't brilliant or warm. Rather, it was sickly, greenish and nearly throbbing. I pried it open. There was a little room inside, barely larger than a closet for storage. Nevertheless, it was packed with cabins. The rooms were small and piled, and the doors were marked with the names of the passengers, including mine. They weren't shelves at all. They were beds. Clean, made, ready, and empty beds. Subsequently, I heard the faint mutter of voices, initially silent, then rising and overlapping cries, laughing and pleas, all blended into a terrible symphony. I whirled and stopped.
All of them were mirrored in a mirror on the distant wall. Not just Martin and the crew, but also other guests I had previously seen, including families, couples, and happy people in the dining hall. They were all jammed against the glass of their small compartments, staring at me with big eyes and mute mouths. Then I caught sight of my own reflection. It wasn't just me though. Something was behind me. A towering, unnaturally thin shadow with arms that were too long and a head that was cocked at an odd angle, like dying embers. Its eyes glowed dimly. It grinned as well. Through the reflection, a voice hissed in my ear, "You're next." I ran. Behind me, Doors slammed, hallways twisted, and the bottom deck layout became illogical. I kept returning to that same chamber at every turn. A wave of panic swept through. As I raced, I felt the shadows creeping down the walls and grabbing for me, stumbling over pipes and scraping my hands on rusting metal. I located the elevator, pressed the passenger decks button. Something within tried to stop the doors from closing. A thin, dark hand. No, many hands pressed against the metal. I pressed the button once more. The elevator trembled, shook, and then soared up. The lights were dazzling when the doors opened. I could hear the hum of everyday ship life. From the pool deck, there was laughter. The lounge's music. I glanced around, but nobody saw my shaky hands or my crazy gaze. I staggered over to my cabin. Martin's face materialized in the hallway with his hands folded and a slight smile. "You succeeded," he remarked. However, there was a problem. The eyes he had were not human. They were unending pools of black. I locked my cabin door after closing it, but the murmurs are still audible to me, through the walls beneath the floorboards. Awaiting, because the ship is always remembering. It doesn't let go, and now, in some way, it is aware of my fear. Story 3. You've heard the saying that the safest location on the water is a cruise ship. Every luxury you can imagine, thousands of passengers, miles of steel, and a crew that is prepared to handle anything. The illusion is that, however, as night falls at sea, illusions break more easily than glass. This time, our tale isn't about Emily, Daniel, or anybody else you've heard of. No, the voice of tonight is that of Michael Reyes, a 34-year-old San Diego software developer who believed that on a week-long cruise would finally help him deal with his ongoing burnout. In the illumination of his monitor, he had worked late into the night for years, eating takeout and gazing at code. His reset button was meant to be this: sunshine, mixed drinks, perhaps even getting to know new individuals. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, Michael boarded the beautiful cruise liner Sapphire Wave, which was carrying close to 4,000 passengers. At first look, it appeared to be a paradise on water, complete with glittering pools, an infinite buffet, and live performances that made people giggle. However, something about the ship pressed against his nerves from the first night on, like a subtle humming he couldn't get rid of. It started as small. His keycard wouldn't unlock his cabin door when he got back from dinner. A steward ran over, looked at it, and scowled. Michael blinked and said, "This card is registered to cabin 935, sir." Cabin 8235 was prominently displayed on his boarding slip, which he was holding. With a regretful look, the steward returned the card to him and turned to go. However, Michael sensed that something was off in the air when he eventually pushed inside his cabin. Twice the lights flickered. Every other hallway was immaculate, but the carpet had a slight marine odor. He tried to sleep that night, but was awakened by the sound of water dripping. He took a seat. The sink in the bathroom was dry, bone dry from the shower. However, the constant, unrelenting drip, 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 like water seeping through imaginary crevices, came from somewhere behind the wall, somewhere in the ship's interior. "It's just bad plumbing," Michael assured himself. Things broke on cruise ships, which were like floating cities. He closed his eyes and rolled over. However, the faint sound of a voice came through the same wall at around 3 in the morning. Mute, in a language he couldn't comprehend, like someone whispering. He put pressure on his ear. The words became more distinct, raspy, moist, and desperate. He swore there was a beat, almost like chanting, but he couldn't make them out. Then there were 3 knocks. Slow, intentional, from within the actual wall. Michael's heart pounded as he leaped back. Pipes expanding. Ship noises. Anything logical, he told himself. In reality, though, he knew deep inside, plumbing was not involved. Mechanics was not involved. Someone was that. He tried to laugh it off when daylight arrived. "If you don't hear from me, it's because the ghosts in this cabin finally claimed me." Kidding. Kidding. Hopefully, he said in a brief videotape he made for his sister back home. He laughed, but his red-rimmed, sleep-deprived eyes betrayed him. Things became more heated during the second night. His phone buzzed on the nightstand as he fell asleep. Unknown number. "Get out of cabin 8235.
was the notification that made his skin go cold. This far out into the ocean, there was no mobile coverage. How did he receive an SMS message? With his stomach in knots, Michael sat there in the faint glow of his phone, trying to figure out whether it was a malfunction, a joke, or something more sinister. But he heard it again before he could respond. The murmur. The trick. Afterwards, it seemed as though whatever was within was creeping closer as the knuckles moved slowly from one corner of the wall to the next. Furthermore, that was just night 2. Michael had trouble staying still. He turned on the cabin lights and paced the small space as if the light would be enough to chase away whatever was hiding in the shadows. The weight of the text message overcame all of his reasonable explanations, including broken wiring, malfunctioning plumbing, and possibly a joke from another traveler. He tested the Wi-Fi on board. Not connected. He looked at his phone's settings, but there was still no service. At breakfast the following morning, Michael looked around the room, looking for faces that may indicate trouble, and his chest constricted as he repeated the words that were blazing on the screen. Get out of cab. Everyone appeared normal, including retirees having coffee, families laughing, and visitors stacking pancakes. At 3 in the morning, no one appeared to have broken into his phone. For a brief moment, the man's smile wavered when he told the steward about the wet walls. It was swift, nearly imperceptible. Yet Michael managed to catch it. The steward answered quietly, "Maintenance will investigate, sir," and quickly left before Michael could ask any more questions. Michael came up with a strategy that evening. He had no intention of sleeping. He sat in the armchair facing the wall where the noises normally started, prepared a strong cup of coffee, and put his phone on record. Hours passed with nothing happening as the clock made its way past midnight. Only the mild swaying of the sea and the hum of the ship. Around 2:17 in the morning, the dripping started up again. This time the sound was inside the room rather than behind the wall. Water darkened the floorboards under the armchair, creating a puddle on the carpet. Michael jumped up and pushed the chair away. He gasped. Neither the pipes nor the ceiling were the source of the water. As if the ship itself were leaking ocean into the space, it was dripping directly from the carpet. His phone then buzzed once more. His hands shaking, he grabbed it. One more message. The same unidentified number. It was followed by a knock. "Don't open the door." It wasn't behind the wall this time. The cabin door had it. Slow, heavy, measured. The door handle trembled a little, as if someone were testing the lock, and Michael froze, staring at it. "Go away, please, go away," he said to himself, and the banging ceased. The room was silent. The phone vibrated again, but Michael's body sagged with relaxation. It turned the doorknob. "It's not gone." With his heel splattering into the puddle that had formed on the carpet, Michael stumbled backward. This time, the metal knob jiggled more forcefully, as if the person or thing outside had become impatient. Then, suddenly, the lights died and flickered. Darkness fell on the cabin. The only light in the room was the soft blue glow from Michael's phone screen. Then he heard it, breathing, inches from the door, rough, wet, and deep. His natural instinct was to open the door and dash down the corridor. He waited, however, as the words on his phone reverberated more loudly than his heartbeat. "Don't open the door." Every nerve was taut as they sat there in the dark, and the breathing continued to drag on until it eventually stopped. A new terror arrived with the morning. Michael's phone displayed yesterday night's recording. Half fearful, half desperate for answers, he pressed play. At first, the video showed his vacant chamber and the ship's hum. Then the water started to drip. The knocking came next. Then he saw it, not from outside the door, but a shadow moving across the cabin floor, crawling out from under the bed from inside the cabin. Michael quickly turned off the phone, smearing the screen with his thumb. Panic blazed in his chest, every instinct telling him that the shadow he saw was genuine and not only a trick of the light. He had spent the entire night sitting a few feet away from it, if it had come from beneath his bed. Pulling the cover up, he crouched down to see underneath. Just the smell of damp wood, stale carpet, and darkness. Nevertheless, his skin pricked like if something invisible were pressing against him. The steward who had eluded him yesterday was cornered by him at breakfast. Michael gripped the man's arm and hissed, "What occurred in 80-20-35 in that cabin?" The steward's eyes grew wide, leaning in close enough for Michael to smell the salt on his uniform. He took a quick look around. "You should not discuss it aloud." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "Not here." He quickly left, his tray clattering on the counter. The more hours passed, the more paranoid Michael became. He saw crew members clustered together in the atrium, their talk abruptly ending as he approached. Later, two passengers gave him an odd look as he crossed the lounge, and then they murmured something that made him tense. He put his phone on record again that evening in an effort to get evidence, something he could force on the team until they acknowledged what was going on. All his clothes on, every muscle taut, he laid on the bed. This time, it began early, at precisely midnight. The leaking, the rap. Then there was a new sound, voices. Dozens of them, faint and muted, were whispering like a mob assembled outside his door. Michael touched the wood with his ear. The murmurs became more distinct, chanting, not in words he could comprehend, but in a rhythmic, ritualistic rising and falling. Heart in his throat, he staggered back. His cell buzzed on the bedside table. One more text. "Stay quiet." The knob turned. Not once. It seemed as though a hand was repeatedly testing the lock. Michael gripped the phone tightly, fearing the screen might shatter. The door moaned, as if straining under an unseen weight. The metal hinges bent. Michael thought for a second that it would explode. The whispers then stopped. The knocking ceased. Silence fell as the dripping slowed. By daybreak, Michael had lost his determination. He slammed his phone down, video cued, and rushed to the purser's desk. He said, Look at what's going on in my room." The woman at the desk did not pick up the phone. She had a stiff, robotic smile. "I believe you've been a bit too excited, sir. Get some fresh air and enjoy the terrace." "I'm not insane," Michael yelled. The passengers turned to observe. The purser's voice was flat as she leaned forward. Michael froze. "I suggest you keep your voice down about cabin 835 if you want to enjoy the rest of your trip." It wasn't precisely a threat the way she stated it. It was terrible. It served as a warning. He made the decision that evening that he could not spend any more time in that cabin. He would sleep anywhere, even on the lifeboats, the lounge, or the pool deck. The lights flickered as he packed his luggage full of stuff. There was another knock. However, it wasn't at the door this time. From the closet, it was inside the room. 3 dull thuds that sounded like they were rattling the hangers rang out from within the closet. Michael's heart pounded. His luggage half-zipped, and he paused in mid-step. He noticed a slight vibration coming from the closet door, as if something was pressing against it from within. "Who's there?" His voice broke, hardly audible above a whisper. The ensuing silence was worse than a response. Michael edged toward the closet and picked up the heaviest object he could reach, a metal lamp from the nightstand. He reached for the knob, his hand shaking. The closer he came, the colder the air felt, as if a freezer door was open and icy currents were leaking onto the carpet. He threw open the door. Nothing. Only his shirts were hung perfectly, swaying a little as if a breeze had moved them. But the moist, saline, metallic smell assaulted him. He had previously detected the same aroma on the steward, rust and salt water. On the bed, Michael's phone buzzed. He grabbed it. One more message. "Now you see it." Before he could respond, the darkness in the closet appeared to grow deeper and expand in an odd way. On the carpet, a shadow gathered and poured out like dark water. It formed into something slightly human as it twisted and pulled itself upward. "Lamp up," Michael stumbled back. "Avoid me at all costs." The shadow figure's head cocked, an outline darker than the dark corners of the room. With no face or eyes, pointing at him, it raised one arm. Then, almost simultaneously, the cabin phone rang. Out loud, startling, Michael almost dropped the lamp because he leaped so violently. He made himself reach for the receiver. "Hey," A ragged, scratchy voice that sounded as though it hadn't spoken in years snarled through the line. "You're in our place." Michael felt sick to his stomach. "What are you?" "You already know," the voice rasped, and the call ended. Behind him, the closet door smashed so hard that the mirror cracked. Michael dragged his bag and staggered out into the hallway. He scurried to the hallway, but the door remained in place. Where the exit had been, there was a smooth slab of metal with no handle or latch. His chest filled with panic. He yelled till his throat burned and pounded with his fists. But the ship made no response. There was a creak in the closet. Michael whirled around. A face half-eaten away, skin hanging like seaweed, clothes torn by salt and time, and wet shoes pouring into the carpet. Something stepped forth. The air was heavy with the smell of brine and rot, with the same broken rasp he had heard on the phone. The figure spoke. "Michael, you checked in. Additionally, nobody checks out." Michael stumbled back, slamming into the wall. He didn't recall holding his phone anymore, but it buzzed again, a message that said, "Passengers like you keep us afloat," displayed on the cracked screen before the lights went off. Michael wasn't there when they turned back on. No bed, not a bag, just a well-appointed cabin, quiet and ready for the next visitor. Additionally, a new name, Michael Graves, Cabin 8235, appears in the logbook at the reception desk. Naturally, however, Cabin 8235 does not exist, even though no one was around to touch it. The logbook closed with a gentle thud, anyhow. The old brass bell rattled as though a hand had brushed by, and the lamp on the reception desk flickered. The ship swung softly, as if calmed by the ocean's pulse. But beneath that serene cadence was something deeper, a beating that wasn't the sea's. Michael's voice, faint, drifted down the empty corridor, repeating the words he'd once said he'd never say aloud. "Don't open the closet." Above deck, passengers were dancing to wind-borne music, clinking glasses and laughing. They were all unaware that the ship had claimed another down below. By dawn, employees would swear they saw a towering, bone-soaked guy in the dining hall, gazing silently from a corner table before he vanished as the lights went down, even though the cabin adjacent to theirs had been closed off for years. Some visitors would report hearing pounding noises from that area of the ship, while the Ocean Crown continued to sail with pride and glitz. Its tummy was bloated with secrets. There was a scream lost to the steel passageways below for every laugh on deck, a step toward the abyss for each dance. One question to ask yourself is, would you dare open the door if you ever find yourself alone on a ship that seems too old, too quiet, or with a cabin that isn't shown on any map? Story 4. Cruise ships are sometimes compared to floating cities, since they are secure, vibrant, and full of happiness. However, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone or something was observing me once I boarded the Starlight Majesty. This trip was meant to be a new beginning for me. Rebecca. I reserved an alone cabin in the hopes that the water would lift the weight that was weighing me down after a difficult breakup and a taxing year at work. The first night was excellent. I even met some nice people who demanded that I join them for dinner, and we had drinks, music, and laughs. However, a shiver went down my spine when I eventually made it back to my cabin and inserted the keycard into the lock. I became aware of it when the door creaked open. My suitcase was sitting erect beside the closet, neatly tucked beneath the bed that morning. Unzip. I had half of my clothes lying around. My room had been visited by someone. Furious and terrified, I called the front desk, but they insisted that no employees had gone inside. The hallway camera was examined by security. No one had entered or exited, and the video was clear. Nevertheless, my belongings were scattered all over the floor as though someone had been searching through them for hours. I told myself that I might have forgotten and left the suitcase in that state, and I attempted to laugh it off. However, I saw something that almost made me scream as I got into bed, my heart still pounding. The handprint on the mirror was foggy. However, the cabin was really cold and I hadn't showered. I just stared at that hazy handprint, frozen in place. My rational side cried out for an explanation. Some trick of the light, moisture, or leftover cleaning solution. It was more than just a smudge though. The form was too exact, too purposeful. Each finger was flattened, and each palm ridge was unique. Half expecting it to dissipate as my breath warmed the glass, I drew closer. It didn't. It held on obstinately, as if it were evidence of another person's existence. That night, I didn't get much sleep. Every ship creak and every move in the corridor seemed to be amplified. I even stared at the mirror till my eyes burned while the cabin light was on. It was gone by daybreak, disappeared as though it had never existed. I sat with two elderly women at breakfast who recommended that I eat the ship's French toast in an attempt to divert my attention. They talked constantly about trips, Cozumel shopping, and how wonderful the previous evening's sunset had been. I was reassured by their normalcy until one of them asked me in passing, "So, who's your travel companion?" I choked on my orange juice when I heard the question. She smiled at me in confusion, saying, "Oh, I'm alone." "Really? That's all." I quickly dismissed it, murmuring something about mistaken identity. But her comment stuck with me. "I could have sworn I saw someone with you when you boarded yesterday." Someone with me? No, I had gone down the gangway by myself. I went back to my cabin and double-checked everything. Suitcase, the closet, restroom, empty. However, the cushion dropped when I sat on the bed, giving the impression that someone else had taken a seat next to me. The temperature dropped, becoming so chilly that it gave me shivers. Then there were 3 knocks, not on the door. Once more the knocks sounded from inside the closet. The closet door was rapped 3 times sharply. The sound was so intentional and human that it made my breath catch. I just gazed, waiting for another sound for a whole minute. It wasn't knocking when it did arrive. Like fingernails dragging on wood, it was a slow, dragging scrape. With my legs shaking, I got to my feet, despite my gut telling me not to open it. However, terror can do odd things. I reached out and grabbed the handle rather than running. Compared to the rest of the room, the metal was quite cold. With my heart pounding, I wrenched the door open. Nothing. There was no one in the closet. There was no sound, no movement, and my garments hung motionless. Too loud, too forced, I laughed uneasily to myself. I became aware of it at that point. The well-ironed suit that I had left on the hanger was gone. It was crumpled on the ground as though someone had picked it up and dropped it. And there's a picture hidden beneath it. My hands were shaking when I took it up. It had wrinkled edges and was aged, black and white. In it, a group of travelers wearing 1950s clothing stood on a cruise ship's deck, grinning, calmed, typical. But there was a visage that chilled my blood in the distant corner, half in shadow, pale, hollow-eyed. It was the identical face I had seen the previous evening in my mirror. My palms clammy. I dropped the picture instantaneously. How had it arrived at all? Then I saw that there was breathing behind me. Slow, ragged, too near. I turned around. There was nobody in the room. I wasn't alone myself. Despite what my eyes told me, every nerve in my body knew it. There was that heavy, charged calm in the air, like the quiet before a lightning strike. After turning on the flashlight and grabbing my phone, I swept the beam across the room, corners, ceiling, beneath the bed, nothing. However, the sensation of being observed persisted. I knelt down and picked up the photo again, trying to catch my breath. I had never noticed the faint text on the reverse until my fingers touched the faded image. My skin pricked as it said, in ragged characters, "He comes when the ship sleeps." Does the ship sleep? Was it night? Did that refer to the time when the decks were empty? The lights in the cabin flickered before I could even comprehend. Once, twice. Then it went out entirely. In the abrupt darkness, I froze. The only light came from my phone's beam, and I noticed movement. Something moving in the mirror above the desk, in that small cone. It's not my reflection. No more. Once more, the figure appeared. The face was hollow-eyed and pallid, It wasn't just standing motionless this time, though. It had a smile on its face. The beam of my flashlight bounced across the room as it slipped in my wet palms. The face was gone when it hit the mirror again. However, the closet door slammed behind me as the 3 words, "You found me," were painted across the glass in hazy condensation that hadn't been there seconds before. The little cabin sounded like a gunshot as the closet door slammed. I spun around to face it as my legs moved before my head could keep up. Once the knob rattled, but then came to a standstill. My heart pounded in my ears as I forcefully gulped. All right, it's just perhaps the draft from the air conditioner, or the knob turned, slowly, consciously. I almost tripped over my own shoes as I staggered back. My trembling hand caused my phone's light to waver, illuminating the walls with a crazed beam. Then I heard it, a murmur. Not from the corridor, not from the restroom, from the closet. At first, it was just the guttural, scraping sound of someone breathing too near a phone call microphone. Then it became sharp and formed syllables. "Open it." My throat became parched. Every gut told me to don't. However, the further I retreated, the more the voice pressed against me, as if it were now within my call, encircling my thoughts. The closet knob ceased rattling and said, "Open it." Quiet. The door then creaked open by itself, slowly. Only a crack, just enough to let me see how completely black it is inside. I forced myself to tilt the flashlight at the opening as I raised it. A hand extended itself, slim, white as bone. 2 lengthy fingers. The nails broke, as though relishing the sensation of being outdoors once more. It glided across the doorframe. I let out a cry and let the phone fall. Broken shadows were cast on the cabin walls as the light slid away over the floor and spun in dizzy circles. When it finally stopped moving, I became aware of something horrifying. The door to the closet was ajar. There was also no longer a silent passenger in the closet. The air in the cabin had altered. The ship's ventilation system no longer produced the same stale, recycled air. Instead, it was thicker and colder, as if someone had put a damp sheet over my lungs. My blood froze when my flashlight beam finally caught on something that made it quiver over the carpet. Footprint. They trailed from the open closet to my bed, moist and too fresh to be anything but real. Bare feet. The type of impressions that belonged to someone who had not spent a lot of time in the sun. My legs refused to cooperate when I tried to push myself to the door. Once again, the low murmur crept through the cabin, freezing me in place. "You abandoned me." The words did not reverberate. They were pressing from the inside out of my skull, not in the air, clamping my palms over my ears in an attempt to stop the gasp. Didn't help. The whisper continued to pierce deeper, pushing its way through my mind. My gaze strayed to the room's corner. Something changed. With its back to me, the figure was slumped down, shivering as if it were losing its strength. Its hair was matted and dripping with seawater that hadn't touched this ship in days, and its head lolled oddly to one side. And I knew it wasn't standing up when it started to rise, bone by bone, inch by inch. It was developing, as if it had been crammed into a room that was never intended for it. The frame of the bed shook. My phone's screen lit up and buzzed across the carpet. Just one alert. Cabin 322. Don't allow him in. My gut became numb. 322. I had been staying at that same number. At the sound, the silent passenger's head jerked, and its long arm shot toward the ground as if it might grab the warning before I could read it. I ran as its fingertips grazed the carpet, only centimeters away from my phone. I can't recall making the decision to run. I went from being in the corner to throwing myself into the corridor when my heart was pounding my ribs, and I was barefoot. Because the sound followed me, I was unable to turn around. Not footsteps. Not breathing. Only that murmur. I can't recall how many decks I ascended, or how many turns I staggered through, until crashing into a crew member. "You left me behind." However, he merely scowled when I stammered and trembled as I tried to explain, pleading with him to inspect cabin 322. "Cabin 322, he said, appearing truly perplexed. "This ship does not have cabin 322. Not in years. 2 days later, the cruise came to an end. All I had left was my luggage, the clothing I was carrying, and a memory I wished I could erase from my mind. Even now, though, I occasionally hear it again, when it's silent at night, and my flat is too quiet. The murmur, just behind me. You left me behind, and each time I hear it, I wonder, where precisely did I spend those 3 nights? If cabin 322 is no longer there. I couldn't stop thinking about what the crew member had said. I gazed at him, expecting a harsh joke, a snicker, or some recognition that he was making fun of me. No cabin 322. However, his face remained fixed. He gave me the pitying, slightly frightened expression you get when you see a drunken guest making a scene. Another passenger walked by us in the hallway before I could reply, muttering, "People always see things on the last night." That statement made me shudder. "Always?" the crewman asked, patting my shoulder, obviously ready to get rid of me, before turning down another corridor, his polished shoes clicking against the deck, in order to make him see the tracks, the dripping figure, and the whisper that had carved itself into my head. I wanted to yell after him, drag him back, and compel him into my cabin. However, the stairwell I had run from was completely dry when I looked back at it. Not a single footprint, no damp carpet, nothing but quiet. Once more, my phone buzzed in my hand. One more message. "He is still with you." My chest fell in on itself. On this cruise, I hadn't given anyone my number. There were only these 2 unexpected messages in the conversation. No contact name, and no history. As I typed a desperate response, my throat constricted. "I'll know you?" The froth formed. A person was typing. However, the response never materialized. I didn't go back to my cabin that evening, while other passengers partied to the music, drinking and joking as if they weren't only hours away from disembarking. I nestled in a corner chair in one of the top deck lounges. I made an effort to persuade myself that the shadows were stationary, and that the glass's reflection wasn't slanting in my direction. I checked my phone every few minutes. The screen didn't change, until 2:11 a.m. The last line of text came up. "Look at your reflection." I froze. The black ocean outside pressed like a wall against the big glass windows that bordered the lounge. I could see my reflection staring back at me, pallid and exhausted, holding onto my phone too firmly. However, there was another factor. Not next to me, not behind me. Within the mirror, the second figure leaned shoulder to shoulder with my reflection, dripping, grinning dimly, and moving its mouth without making any noise through the glass. "You abandoned me," I yelled, tumbling back and slamming into a table with half-empty beverages. The bartender yelled something about interrupting me, and the passengers laughed, assuming I was intoxicated. However, none of them gave the mirror a glance. The object was crushed on my palm, flat against the opposite side of the glass, yet none of them noticed. I didn't get any sleep. The ship docked the following morning. Announcements echoed through the corridors. Luggage clattered, and families celebrated. The world continued. However, a voice growled in my ear as I pulled my suitcase to the customs line. Not in my mind. In the glass, no. They're next to me. "You can get off the ship, but you can't get off me, and I'll drop you off there. If you're reading this, I must ask you this. Would you still remain in a cabin you reserved on a cruise ship if you later discovered that room wasn't listed in the blueprint, or would you bolt as soon as you saw the door's number? I'd like to know what you would do, so please share your opinions in the comments section, and remember to subscribe to Midnight Outcry, and click the bell button if you're bold enough to hear more of these authentic experiences that we unearth from reliable sources. For the next traveler, it could be you. At the next port, I ought to have disembarked. I should have asked for assistance, reported the messages, insisted on changing cabins, something. However, dread has a peculiar way of making you freeze rather than fight. When I exited the lounge that evening,
The ship's hallways felt like a labyrinth I had never traversed before. Doors emerged, where I swore there had never been any, and hallways curved in ways I couldn't recall. The air felt thick, as if it held weight, but it wasn't humid. Then I heard them. Voices.
Not in any language I knew, not in English. Even though the hallway was empty, there were layered voices, sluggish phrases, and low murmurs that reverberated. The music seemed to push into my skull, pulling me forward, and I followed them because I had no other option. I followed it to a stairway. Shadows moved from above. Halfway up the stairs, I froze, clutching the railing until my knuckles burned. At the landing, 4 crew members formed a half circle. There was something on the floor between them with their backs to me. In the faint light, it glistened moist, but I couldn't figure out what it was. A crewman said, "An additional donation." No reports, no records. My breath caught. It's just the way the ship sails. They seemed to have detected me since they turned too fast, and I knew they noticed me at that moment. They had no astonishment, rage, or even fear in their eyes. They were well known, as if I wasn't the first traveler to discover this. I ran. I didn't rush to my hiding place. I had no idea where I was running to. I only heard my feet thumping on the deck and doors slamming as I hurried through hallways in search of a location that seemed normal once more. However, the ship refused to let me. I kept getting pulled into tighter hallways, dimmed illumination, and carpets that felt like they were soaked through at every turn. Iron and salt combined to create a metallic flavor that stuck to the back of my tongue. After my lungs burnt, I saw the text. "Avoid running, you will just enrage him." I came to a complete halt. My shaking fingers were illuminated with a dim light as the phone's screen gleamed in the darkness. Footsteps behind me. Then, footsteps dragging, wet. I pivoted. There was nobody in the hallway. Despite the fact that no one was visible walking on the carpet, it darkened, with each step leaving its mark on the fibers and reducing the gap between us. I staggered forward, almost stumbling over my luggage, and yelled. It was there, sliding with me as though it had followed, even though I couldn't recall touching it. There was a minor tilt to the ship. It was a sharper, more purposeful sway than the typical ocean waves, as if the ship itself were tilting in my direction. I found myself back at the glass lounge. Both the passengers and the music were vanished. It was only me, the vast expanse of black water hitting the windows, and the ocean outside, as well as my own reflection. This time, though, I saw more than simply him by my side. I saw him in my seat. The sopping wet body was lounging in the exact spot where I had been sitting hours before. His lips twisted into a smile and his head tilted, like a video buffering on a bad connection. His actions were mine, but they were half a second slower. He raised his hand when I did, but his palm splattered the inside of the glass with dark water. Once more, the message ping occurred. In unison, the figure mouthed the words, "Check your reflection." That was the tipping point. I screamed and pounded till my fists hurt as I pushed for the glass. However, the figure remained intact. The reflection remained intact. It simply leaned in until its forehead touched mine through the partition. Then it started talking. Not over the phone. From the glass. "No, you left me in the water," someone said behind me, and my nostrils were filled with the smell of salt rot. My legs buckled. "Good morning." The ship pulled into port. Baggage clattered onto carts. Parents hugged and children rejoiced. It was just another safe return from a lovely trip to everyone else. But my phone buzzed one last time as I dragged myself down the gangway. Won't save you." I whirled around, trying to grab the sender. However, I just saw laughing families and the sun's unwavering brightness. Additionally, the crowd was reflected back at me by glass walls in the customs queue. There was just one individual depicted in each reflection, aside from mine, because there were two in mine. Tell me, would you believe your eyes if you saw someone else's smile in your own reflection? Or would you break the glass to verify it? Remember to subscribe to Midnight Outcry and click the bell button if you're still listening, so that you'll be the first to know about any future real encounters. Because not all passengers are able to depart even though ships may dock.